Hey guys, welcome to your first recorded presentation on the Renaissance. Just a couple of reminders before we begin. You can choose whether or not you want to take notes on this, either writing everything down or remember where I showed you on Edmodo where you can access fill in the blank notes to make things a little bit easier. You will be coming across some slides that give you instructions on either to watch a video and take notes or perhaps answer some questions from the PowerPoints that should be submitted for homework the next day. These are mandatory. And also please keep in mind that your daily quizzes will be combined with both the presentations as well as readings from your textbook. So why don't we go ahead and get started? We're going to pick up basically right where we left off in the Middle Ages and pick up with what is known as the Renaissance. So it's important that you understand that during the Dark Ages, pretty much everyone was illiterate, and that's one of the reasons why it's called the Dark Ages, is because there was no enlightenment. It's not that it was dark for 500 years, but rather there was a lack of learning. Pretty much the only literate people at the time were religious leaders, and the reason for this is because they needed to be able to read in order for them to copy the Bible. So you can pretty much understand what that would mean for society if the religious leaders are the only ones who can read. They can pretty much teach the people whatever they want. But it was very important for these religious leaders to be literate. Things started to change a little bit, though, around the year 1300. Now, this date is often debated by historians as the beginning of the Renaissance, but many people argue it a lot because of what was happening at this time, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the reason for it is because of the introduction of a movement known as humanism. It's important to understand the definition of humanism. Your book goes into detail, and there's a couple videos you're going to be able to watch later. But the reason why it was important is because it was a movement away from just studying the Bible. Instead, humanist thinkers were now encouraged to study the past, specifically the ancient Greek and Roman culture that had flourished in Europe centuries earlier, and also the study of the Latin language as well. And the way that they were able to do this is that scholars started to search the entire continent of Europe for any Greek and Roman writings that they could find. And the way that they did this is a lot of these writings were able to come into the continent by means of the Crusades. People who had gone over to the Middle East during the Crusades had brought these writings back with them because the Arabs were the ones who preserved them. Now, there's a couple videos that I have here that go into much greater detail on humanism. There's three of them noticed by a fellow AP teacher known as Paul Sargent. He has his own YouTube channel. You guys are going to become very familiar with him because I use a lot of his videos, as well as another teacher named Tom Ritchie, who is hilarious. So please take the time at this moment to pause the presentation and watch these three videos. They're under 10 minutes each. And then notice the assignment that I have attached to this. You need to be able to fully answer each of these three questions. What was humanism? What was secular humanism? And what was civic humanism, based on the information that you find in the videos. And this will be handed in tomorrow for a homework assignment. You can choose to keep going with the presentation if you like, but you definitely need to go back and watch these videos. Now that you know what humanism was, we're going to pick up again and talk about when the Renaissance actually happened. Before I said the year 1300, notice here this slide says 1350. Again, it's a date that's often debated by historians. But basically they agree that it lasted all the way until about 1600, and you'll see when we get to that time period why they believe the Renaissance started to end. So everything that we discuss over the first quarter, including the Reformation, the Age of Discovery and Exploration, and even the Scientific Revolution, all of this is happening simultaneously. It's not like one thing happened and then the other. All of this is taking place at the same time. It's important that you keep that in mind. Now, what does the word Renaissance mean? As you know, it means rebirth. It's a French word for rebirth. What was it a rebirth of? Well, basically, it's a rebirth of what is known as classical knowledge, and that those classics, whenever you hear me use the term classical, we're referring to the Greeks and the Romans. They had such flourishing, wonderful civilizations that existed that were full of art and architectural feats, as well as learning and language, and that had been dormant for 500 years during the Middle Ages, and now it was being rebirthed in the Renaissance. And what was really good for the location, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, is they were able to see remnants of these civilizations. The architectural and artistic ruins of both the Greeks and the Romans still remained in several areas. So they could look around and see these statues and see these buildings and say, hey, what was that civilization all about? And because of this increase in knowledge, this celebration of the human spirit, as you learned about humanism, it inspired many people at the time to start imitating the exact same things that they saw from the Greeks and Romans. And we'll discuss that more in our next presentation when we talk about Renaissance art. But the transformation first began in the cities themselves. And the reason for that is because they had to completely reimagine the way a city was designed. Medieval cities really grew out of nothing. There was no central planning. They were very ugly, they were disorganized, they were dirty, they were smelly, and so people wanted to start living their lives. Renaissance cities, on the other hand, specifically ones like Florence, they were redesigned in order to have open places. And these open places where people could gather were known as piazzas, and these were modeled after the forums that ancient Rome had. You can see from this picture, this is Piazza del Popolo. This is a modern picture. I actually took this photograph when I studied in Rome. But you notice there's no traffic here. There's two churches that are located here, and then actually up in the back, you can see that there's a park. You can't notice it in this picture. But people are wandering freely. People would gather here, maybe sit by the fountain, and spend some time together. And that's what they were trying to reimagine. Here's another famous piazza. This is Piazza Navona. This is also in the center of Rome. You can see a church there on the right and several fountains in the middle. This is also closed to traffic and open. Not only that, but architecture started to change. For example, especially when it came to the churches, what you're looking at here is Notre Dame in Paris, but the architecture is known as Gothic, and really it was to denote this grandeur when people would walk in and their eyes would be elevated to as if they had entered heaven. But that was no longer the type of architecture that was used. Instead, Renaissance architects started to build churches that were inspired by classical buildings, so oftentimes you would see them with columns, but also they were starting to use math and symmetry, and so they started making buildings with geometric shapes like you see here. This is the Duomo in Florence, and we'll talk about this later as well. So why specifically did the Renaissance begin in northern Number one, first of all, was Italy involved in the 100 Years' War? No, it wasn't. Do you remember which two countries were? That's right, England and France. So since they had not suffered through wars like the 100 Years' War, the Crusades, or anything like that, they had been able to maintain a relative balance of peace. Number two, the other reason it started in Italy is because a very wealthy merchant class had existed there. And so as a result, the merchant class was able to support the arts. More on that a little bit later. Also, as was mentioned before, Italy had easy access to the ancient Greek and Roman heritage. They were able to see the ruins like the Pantheon and the Roman Colosseum that you see here. And so that hasn't disappeared. You can still see it today. And so when they looked on these things, they looked to their past and they wanted to celebrate it and give rebirth to it, especially because it was right in their own backyard. And finally, due to their easy access to the Mediterranean Sea, the Italian people were able to absorb ideas from all over the world at that time. It was a crossroads for people from the Middle East, for example. They were right next to Greece, where they could see the Parthenon. And it was where people would come for trade and so forth. So their geographic location was ideal as well. Now, northern Italy is specifically where the Renaissance started. And the reason for that is because it was made up of a series of what are known as large city-states. Now, city-states might sound familiar to you because it's also known as like an independent nation. I'm sure you've heard the term before. But why is this important to the Renaissance? Well, keep in mind it was also the same system that existed in ancient Greece, and they had been successful, so this wasn't anything new in Europe. But as a result, Italy now was not only these city-states, but within the city-states they had very large cities, especially the ones that had been redesigned. It was urban. Pretty much the rest of Europe, like France and England, they still lived under the feudal system. They were still rural. They still very highly relied on farming. Now, granted, there were parts of Italy that were still farming, but for the most part, in northern Italy, they had developed these large cities. It's important to understand those city-states, however. Let's go back to that. There was no united Italian government. Italy was fragmented, and we're going to go back to that several times throughout this semester. And the leaders of these individual city-states were now able to figure things out on their own. They didn't have to answer to a king, for example, but now they could manage things on their own ways. And because well, I'll get to that in just a moment. I forgot about this slide. Some of these leaders, too, they even used their own money. Remember, they were wealthy merchants, and they used their money and their power to have great works of art created. Here's one example that I have. Now, by far, the leaders that used most of their money, of course, were going to be the religious leaders. For example, here's a self-portrait. Well, he didn't paint it, but he commissioned to have this portrait painted of Pope Nicholas V. He's known as the first Renaissance Pope. And that's him there in all of his glory. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Another thing that is important to keep in mind is that, unfortunately, Italy was hit the hardest when it came to the plague. Over 60% alone of the Italian population was destroyed. And so, as a result, most of the people who died in the plague were the laborers or the farmers or the poor people, because remember, the plague was spread by filth. And so if you didn't have, a proper home to protect yourself, chances are you were going to die from the plague. And so now most of the customers and the workers had died from the plague, so the wealthy merchants were like, hey, we don't have anybody to buy our stuff, but we still have money, we're still making money on trade, let's try something new. And so when the Renaissance was born, they pursued other interests, for example, art. And with the rise of humanism and the celebration of what humans were capable of, again, this is how the Renaissance was born. And remember, we talked about those city-states before. They were able to establish governments on their own that were ruled by individuals. They were ruled by merchants, not nobles. And so what's the difference? Think about it for just a moment. How does a noble get their rulership? That's right, it's by birth. But how does a merchant become powerful? This time it's going to be by merit. And that's one of the major themes of the Renaissance. How can a human be able to accomplish what they want to accomplish by their own individual merit, their talents, not necessarily based on what they can inherit from their father. And that's why things started to change. And Italy was the perfect for it. Before, I mentioned that the birth of the Renaissance was in the city-state of Florence. And Florence is a perfect example of this, not only because of its art, but also because of the rulership that took place there, which came under the Medici family, or the Medici, depending on how you want to say it. And here is a beautiful portrait of this family. They ruled for hundreds of years. It stayed within the family, or not. And so why were they able to accomplish this? Well, that's because they made their fortune through trade and banking. And so, as I mentioned, they were wealthy merchants. They actually were the richest family in all of Europe for a period of time. And there is Lorenzo in all his glory. Isn't he quite handsome, ladies? I'll let you answer that question on your own. Anyway, they were a very important family, and your textbook goes into a little bit more detail on that, so I'll let you read your book to help fill in the blank there. But it is important to understand why these Renaissance merchants and city-state leaders like the Medicis decided to commission artists. Because if you look at this painting, for example, I'll give you a moment to take it all in. Would you call it beautiful? Would you call it talent? I mean, honestly, I couldn't draw this, but there's really not much to it. It's very confusing. There's no depth. There's no perspective. And this is a classic example of Middle Ages art. Not really something that you could see somebody paying a lot of money for. And so the Renaissance artists and the scholars of the time, they started to look down on this, and they were kind of embarrassed. Instead, they wanted to return to the learning of the Greeks and the Romans. Look at the difference between this painting and the one, or this sculpture and the painting I just showed you before. You could see movement almost, even though it's a marble statue. You could see movement in this woman's garment, details in her face, quite different skill level between medieval art and Renaissance art. As I mentioned before, they could look around and see examples of these ancient pieces of art, especially in Rome, and they really wanted to achieve even better creations than the Greeks and the Romans had. And so as a result, many Renaissance thinkers, grasping these humanist ideals, they started to study, specifically in Latin, things like history, literature, philosophy. Now, what are those subjects called? If you said humanities, you are correct. And so why are they important? I want you to stop for just a minute and think about that. Why should we study history? We already answered that question. Why is literature so important? Philosophy. It's the study of us. It's the history of people and what they've accomplished and what they can accomplish. And so now that people were becoming more literate, and the humanism was influential in most of Italy, this is what the thinkers started to study. And what's interesting about this is this wasn't something that was condoned by the church, because the church said, no, you need to study the Bible and that's it. And that's going to be very important. I'm kind of planting a seed here because that's going to set the tone for our next unit when we talk about the Reformation. People were starting to think for themselves before everyone's life completely revolved around the church. The church was still very important. I don't want you to think that it started losing status, but now they were going beyond just what the Bible said. Now, as I mentioned before, the heart of the Renaissance was here in Florence. This is a wonderful modern-day picture of what Florence looks like today with the Duomo in the background. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, in your next PowerPoint, who the architect was and why that's a symbol of the Renaissance. But the reason why Florence was the heart of the Renaissance is because there was many wealthy patrons there. That's where the Medicis were from, and they were able to fund those projects. And this is really where the Renaissance would take off. And so we're going to talk more about Renaissance artists that came from Florence, why it started specifically in this city-state. And if you would like to continue, There's this amazing video by Rick Steves. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he's a world traveler and he does all sorts of travel books and travel guides. And he does an excellent video that is going to tell you even more about the artwork in Florence and why it is the heart of the Renaissance. Notice I have a little note there. You can skip, if you skip, once you get to 12 minutes and 56 seconds, you can go ahead and skip all the way to 19 minutes and 30 seconds because he's just going to kind of, I mean, you're welcome to watch the whole thing if you want, but just to kind of, show you exactly what you need. If you don't want to watch this video right now, that's completely fine. I understand if you're tired, but you will need to watch this video before the next PowerPoint. So I'll go ahead and put it on that one as well so you have it. So that pretty much wraps it up. I hope you learned a lot about the Renaissance, why it started in Italy. Make sure you understand those